Module 13, Literary Criticism. Aristotle, Poetics is the first topic. So, the Poetics is a short treatise of 26 chapters. And we can divide these 26 chapters into 6 parts. That is from chapter 1 to 5. It is an introductory section and it gives remarks on poetry and classification of poetry into different kinds. Then from chapter 6 to 19, there is discussion of tragedy. From chapter 20 to 22, there is discussion of poetic diction, style, vocabulary, etc. Chapter 23 discusses on narrative poetry and tragedy. And chapter 24 and 26 discusses of epic and its comparison with tragedy. And chapter 5 deals with the objections of critics against poetry and Aristotle's reply to it. So this is all about the chapter divisions of the Poetics. You have to go through each chapters, point out the theories and whatever keynotes and keywords are there in each chapters of the Poetics. And after that you can elaborate and express in detail during the exam session. Sir Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry is also known as a defense of poesy and also the defense of poetry. Sidney wrote the defense before 1583. It is generally believed that he was at least partly motivated by Stephen Gosson, a former playwright who dedicated his attack on the English stage, the School of Abuse, to Sidney in 1579. So the whole criticism, the apology for poetry can be divided into 5. First one discusses about the antiquity and universality of poetry. Second, the different kinds of poetry and their usefulness. Third, Sidney's reply to the current objections against poetry. And fourth, discussion of the state of contemporary English poetry and drama and his objection to tragicomedy and violations of the unities. And the fifth one is remarks on style, diction and versification. The most important thing that you have to focus is on the charges against poetry by Stephen Gosson and the reply of Philip Sidney to those charges, like poetry is useless, as a waste of time, and poetry is a mother of lies, nurse of abuse, it corrupts people, and Plato banished poets. These were the charges put forward by Stephen Gosson, and you have to go through the reply of Philip Sidney, that according to him poetry was a virtuous action and it deals only with ideal truths and it will not corrupt people because it's all about the way people misuses poetry, and that's why Plato also was against the misuse of poetry. Samuel Coleridge's Biographia Literaria is a 2-volume work in 23 chapters. So we can divide the 23 chapters into 2 parts. That is, the first part is the first 16 chapters of philosophizing, and last 7 chapters discusses the poetic theory of Wordsworth, which gives a remarkable demonstration of Coleridge's critical powers. The last three chapters enduring description of romantic theory. Coleridge's theory of imagination links in both parts, both in every chapters of the essay. So in our syllabus, it is only chapter 14, that is the first part, which is of philosophizing. So chapter 14 deals with the nature and function of poetry. It is discussed in philosophical terms. He discusses about the difference between the poetry and prose and the immediate function of poetry. Then there are two cardinal points of poetry. That is, first one is the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature. And the second one is the power of giving the interest of novelty by modifying it with the colors of imagination. The willing suspension of disbelief. According to Coleridge, poem contains the same elements as prose composition, but the difference is between the combination of those elements and objects aimed in both the combination, like meter or rhyme in poem. The purpose of prose is to convey the truth, like scientific and historical composition, and give pleasure, like romance and novels. Then he also discusses the difference between poem and poetry. So poetry is of highest kind, may exist without meter and even without the contradistinguishing objects of a poem. The poem of any length neither can be nor ought to be all poetry. Then instead of defining what poetry is, he proceeds to describe a poet. And from the poet, he proceeds to enumerate the characteristics of imagination. So poetry is an activity of poet's mind, and a poem is merely one of the forms of its expression of that activity. And that poetic activity is basically an activity of imagination. A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf is hailed as a feminist Bible. It is a balanced and somber approach to the question of women and fiction, women's position in society, and the factors that impede the natural outflow of her creativity. The narrator begins her investigation at Oxbridge College. She then spends a day in the British Library, perusing the scholarship on women, all of which has written by men in anger. And then turning to history, she finds so little data about the everyday lives of women. And there is a figure of Judith Shakespeare with a tragic fate. She considers the achievements of the major women novelists of the 19th century, and finally, there is an exhortation to the women to take up the tradition. Woolf advances the thesis on women and fiction that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. In Tradition and Individual Talent, T.S. Eliot violently refuted the view that the greatness of a poet lies in his originality, individuality, or his difference from other poets. He says that it is often seen that not only the best but the most individual parts of a work may be those in which the dead poets, the ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. According to him, the tradition is not blind adherence to the past, nor is it something that can be inherited. One has to acquire it with great labor. It demands the historical sense, which is not simply knowledge of history. It involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. a sense of balance which trains one to discriminate one's passion from objective criterion. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. It may be equated with the effect of serial rereading. It is the collective mind, the repository of tradition. It is more important than our own private mind. This thought will chasten him and put him through the process of continual self surrender. The progress of an artist is a continual self sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. It is in this depersonalization that art approaches the condition of science. In Archetypes of Literature, Northrop Frye states that the archetypes make the concepts of the universe better understandable for the human beings. The archetypes develop in accordance to human needs and concerns, which makes them proper to human life. Fry has identified two major categories: comedic, further subdivided into comedy and romance, and tragic, further subdivided into tragedy and satire. He has also identified a connection between various seasons and the different literary genres. For instance, comedy is related to season of spring, tragedy to autumn, satire with winter, and romance to summer. Fry also advocates a difference in the way a symbol is interpreted in connection with different genres. For example, humans in comedic work for fulfillment of wishes. In tragic, it acts in a tyrannical way, leading to isolation, downfall. Animals are gentle and pastoral in comedy, while predatory in tragedy. There will be gardens, parks, and flowers in comic, but in tragedy, there will be wild forest or barren lands. Water is present in the form of river in comedy, and it appears as flood and seas in tragedy. He also understands that there are some neural archetypes as well which could not be identified as clearly to either of the tragic and the comic. However, he has made the concept quite clear to make the analysis of archetypes. In Language of Paradox, Clint Brooks takes on the language of poetry, stating that at its core, poetry is a language of paradox. That is, it is made up of a dynamic balance of opposing ideas, attitudes, and feelings. This argument is based on the idea that referential language is too vague. For the specific message a poet expresses, he must make up his language as he goes. Wordsworth, who is entirely simple and pure as a poet, is also a paradoxical poet in his typical poems, such as It is a Beauteous Evening, where evening is compared to a nun. Another example is from Composed upon Westminster Bridge. In the poem, London is a man made marvel, and in many respects in opposition to nature. The speaker does not view London as a mechanical and artificial landscape, but as a landscape composed entirely of nature. John Donne also had this quality in abundance. Brooks ends his essay with a reading of John Donne's poem, The Canonization, which uses paradox as its underlying metaphor. Using a charged religious term to describe the speaker's physical love as saintly, Donne effectively argues that in rejecting the material world and withdrawing to a world of each other, the two lovers are appropriate candidates for canonization. A similar paradox is also used by Shakespeare in his Romeo and Juliet. Edmund Wilson's essay Marxism and Literature is an attempt at an evaluation of the impact of Marxism on art, literature, and literary criticism. He proves that art and literature cannot be weapons for social, economic, and political propaganda. He explains the role of literature in Marxian system and various thoughts of different Marxist philosophers and thinkers. Karl Marx and Engels never believed that art and literature were conditioned and determined by social and economic aspects alone. They responded to art purely on its artistic merits. But Lenin believed that art should be specialized as a weapon for social change. This was dichotomy and contradiction. According to Trotsky, a work of art should be accepted or rejected by its own laws and not by the principles of Marxism. Stalin reduced literature to a state of manipulating the people, a mere journalism or instrument of state policy and weapons of communist propaganda. For later Marxists, literature is good if it is ideologically sound. Edmund Wilson, with critical analysis, studies the various stages of communist perspective of literature and literary criticism. Feminist Criticism in the Wilderness is the essay by Elaine Showalter. It is an attempt to study the field of literary criticism from feminist point of view. Showalter has tried to study the various aspects of feminist criticism while also pointing out the aims it should be trying to attain, the problems it faces, and the reasons for these problems. The essay considers the fact that, like feminist creative writers, feminist critics also face certain obstacles which have got highlighted after the rise of feminism. Showalter has tried to analyze in detail that feminist criticism is in wilderness, which means feminist critics are not capable enough to produce coherent speculations. The essay deals with pluralism and the feminist critique, defining the feminine, gynocritics and women's text, women's body, women's writing, women's language, women's psyche, and women's culture. Difference is a central concept in Derrida's deconstruction, a critical outlook concerned with the relationship between text and meaning. The term difference means difference and deferral of meaning. Difference undermines the unity and coherence of a text when a deconstructive reading is performed. Consequently, meaning is disseminated across the text and can be found only in traces in the unending chain of signification. In the free play of meanings, one signifier leads to a signified, which itself becomes a signifier for another signified, and so on, such that the ultimate signified, that is, transcendental signified, that which transcends all signifiers, is never attained. The fetishism of commodities and the secret thereof. Karl Marx argues that things have no value if they are not able to change. Then they will have no vitality. Commodities seem to take on reality outside of man, inside themselves. Commodities become capital when they become productive. People in the capitalist society thus begin to treat commodities as if value inhered in the objects themselves rather than in the amount of real labor expended to produce the object. So the real producers of the commodities remain largely invisible. Sigmund Freud, the conscious and the unconscious. The conscious mind contains all the thoughts, memories, feelings, and wishes of which we are aware at any given moment. The unconscious mind is a reservoir of feelings, thoughts, urges, and memories that are outside of our conscious awareness. The unconscious contains contents that are unacceptable or unpleasant, such as feelings of pain, anxiety, or conflict. The id and the ego and the superego. The id is the impulsive and unconscious part of our psyche which responds directly and immediately to the basic urges, needs, and desires. The ego operates according to the reality principle, working out realistic ways of satisfying its demands, often compromising and postponing satisfaction to avoid negative consequences of society. The superego's function is to control its impulses, that is, those which society forbids. Beyond the principle Beyond the pleasure principle is a 1920 essay by Freud that marks a major turning point in its theoretical approach. Previously, Freud attributed most human behavior to the sexual instinct. With this essay, Freud went beyond the simple pleasure principle, developing his drive theory with the addition of the death drives. Jürgen Habermas' Modernity and Incomplete Project. Modernity is a child of enlightenment. It is anchored in reason and democracy, and therefore Habermas sees modernity as an unfinished project. For Habermas, modernism arises out of modernity, the condition of the new, which lines a constantly changing path to the future. Enlightenment is the point at which a new role of art was devised. Increased attention to objective science, universal law, and morality and autonomous art would lead the way towards an improved world. Raymond Williams' essay Tradition, Institution, Formations. Tradition is a concept that Marxism has almost completely ignored. However, William considers tradition to be the most powerful means of incorporation as long as we can see tradition not in the traditional Marxist fashion but as an active process of selection, an intentionally selective version of a shaping past and a pre-shaped present, which is then powerfully operative in the process of social and cultural definition and identifications. The process of the creation of a tradition is usually thought to take place in identifiable institutions, particularly ones involved in socializations. Educational institutions, for instance, are sites where selected knowledge and skills are taught to children as ways for making them recognize what social reality is and how to live in it, along with other institutions such as religious institutions, media, and certain state institutions. Formations are conscious movements and tendencies, literary, artistic, philosophical, or scientific, which can usually be readily discerned after their formative productions. Formations are specialized practices occurring outside of institutions, but which we can enter into institutions stemming from meanings and values in the wider and more diffuse social sphere. In the essay Shakespeare and the Exorcist, Stephen Greenblatt develops a progressive relationship between religious ceremony and the theatre. The ceremony is exorcism, and theatre is Shakespeare's King Lear. The English Church rules the people and is upset by the presence of Catholics performing exorcisms. Greenblatt meditates on the relation between life, art, and theatricality in a sharply defined cultural context. He means to cook his cultural materials, though not to overcook them, and also to do some literary analysis. Two lectures from Power and Knowledge by Michel Foucault. Foucault, in a retrospective mood, attempts to explain the evolution of his theory of power. Foucault discusses his two methodological tools, archaeology and genealogy. In the first lecture, he presents a viewpoint of history as a network of random mirror events and consequent results rather than a line of constant progression. In the second lecture, he asserts that to interpret history in this way leads to the conclusion that power is an inextricable part of its causality. Next essay, The Unities of Discourse from the Archaeology of Knowledge and the Discourse on Language. The discursive regularities ask what kind of unities really do exist in the history of discourse. Foucault tries four hypotheses in which unity is based on the object of discourse, the author of the discourse, the concept used in discourse, or the theories and themes of discourse. Edward Said begins his introduction to Orientalism by explaining how Orientalism is defined within three different contexts. Academically, the term refers to the act of studying or otherwise engaging with the Orient. In a more informal context, Orientalism is a way of thinking about the Orient when contrasted with the Occident, the West. Finally, Said evokes Michel Foucault's concept of discourse to describe how historically Orientalism is a specifically Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. In the essay, his focus is on describing the framework for the creation and perpetuation of the concept of Orientalism. Helen Sixow's The Laugh of Medusa has become a seminal essay, particularly because it announces what Sixow called écriture féminine, a distinctive mode of writing for women and by women. Sixow is issuing her female readers an ultimatum of sorts. Either they can read it and choose to stay trapped in their own bodies by a language that does not allow them to express themselves, or they can use their bodies as a way to communicate. She argues that écriture féminine allows women to address their needs by building strong self-narratives and identity. The essay includes the argument that writing is a tool women must use to advocate for themselves in order to acquire the freedom women have historically been denied. In the book Epistemology of the Closet, Sedgwick argues that standard binary oppositions limit freedom and understanding, especially in the context of sexuality. Sedgwick argues that limiting sexuality to homosexuality or heterosexuality in a structured binary opposition is just too simplistic. It attacks the question of what makes up human sexuality. The basis for the answer to this question comes from Sedgwick's understanding and examination of queer theory, which she decides for her readers. The book also focus on language's impact on sexuality and how labeled speech acts are ultimately the proof of the natures of one's sexuality.